Hi class, today we're going to be talking about sin. I'm sorry, today we're going to be talking about sin. I got something in my throat there. Anyway, so let's get started. Before we do these notes, something that you're going to need notes page number 5, which you should have, and if you don't have, you can find it on Edline. And as we go through this presentation, you can just kind of fill in some of the notes that are missing. There's some kind of fill in the blank things. There's also some exercises for you at the end that I'll show you what to do with. Also, be sure to not just stick to the words on the PowerPoint. You're supposed to be taking notes on the whole presentation, so things that I say, things that you think of, that's all part of good note taking. But let's go ahead and get started. The nature of sin. You'll see here I have some pictures of various things that we associate with sin. I have the apple or the fruit from the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve and the snake story. I have somebody tied up under oppression. I have somebody holding the gun at you, which is like violent sin, that sort of thing. So first of all, what is sin? I'll give you the textbook definition. In the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which is like a summary of all the things that the Church teaches, it says that sin is a failure in love for God, for neighbor, or for self. So anytime you do something or don't do something that is failing to love God, neighbor, or yourself, that's a sin. A few things about sin. One, it's always got to be a free decision. If you did it on accident, it's not quite a sin. It's not really a sin. It's got to be a decision you make. If you're forced into it, it's not really a sin. We'll talk more about that later. But generally, to be a sin, it has to be a free decision. Also, sins harm relationships. If you remember in the last unit when we talked about hell and the separation and isolation of hell, sin and vice is what harms relationships, what drives us apart from one another. So that's what sin does. It harms relationships. And that sin is unnatural. This is a really key point because we think about the idea that everybody sins. We say to err is human, to sin is human. I'm only human. I make mistakes. People say that all the time. And that's true because all humans sin. But God did not make us to sin. God did not make us for that purpose. Sin is something kind of unnatural that goes against what human beings are supposed to be. So a lot of times people think about Jesus and they think, oh, was he really human because he didn't sin? But actually, sinning goes against being human. So because he didn't sin, that actually made him more human than us. That makes us more like the animals, that we're like slaves to our instincts and passions and desires, that we can't do what's right when we're failing to use our free will to do what's right. So sin, actually, from a Christian perspective, is unnatural. It goes against our nature as being made in the image and likeness of God. So another misunderstanding of sin, a lot of people think that something is a sin because it breaks a rule, and so that's why they think it's wrong. They say, oh, it breaks a rule, and that's why it's wrong. And that's kind of backwards. It's not wrong because it breaks a rule. There's a rule because it's wrong. So the more deep understanding is that sin is wrong because it hurts us, it hurts other people, and it hurts our relationship. So yes, there is a rule, but God made those rules for a reason. It's like if you're driving along a cliff and there's a guardrail there to keep you from going over the cliff. Okay? To run up against the guardrail is wrong, not because you're going to hurt the guardrail, but because you're going to go off the cliff. Okay, if there was no guardrail there, it would still be wrong. It would still be just as dangerous. So if you take the rule away, it doesn't make the thing any less wrong or harmful. If all the bishops and the Pope got together and came down and said, you know what, we're not going to say that, killing and stealing and all those things are wrong anymore. They would still be wrong. They would still hurt people just as much. So I think that's an important thing that a lot of people misunderstand. So now we're going to go through some types of sin. First, original sin and actual sin. We'll talk a lot more about original sin next semester when we get into Adam and Eve. But we use the word sin a couple of different ways. We talk about sins that people commit, so like I punch you and that's a sin. But we also talk about there being sin in the world or sin infecting us. We talk about sin as a disease, something that happens to us rather than something that we do. When we're talking about sin as a disease with a big S, the entity of sin that exists in the world, we're talking about original sin. When we're talking about specific actions that people do, that's when we're talking about actual sin. That's why it's ACT. That's why it's act. Okay? So that's with a little s, sins. So original sin is a disease. It's the disease of sinfulness that we all inherit and pass on. It's why we have to be taught to be good. It's why we have to be taught to share. It's why we have to be taught to be honest and all those sorts of things. Because God made us originally to be in the image and likeness of God, to be good, but because of original sin, we're all kind of born in this broken state. We're born in this state where we need to be saved, where we're imperfect. Now that perpetuates because of actual sin. So we're born with vices. We're born with these sinful tendencies, and then we kind of carry that out through actual sins. All right, so moving right along. All right, so the difference between a personal sin and a social sin. Let me give you an example. Let's say this is you, all right? So this is you right there, and this is your friend Horsey, and you knock him over. That is a personal sin because you personally did it. Now, let's go back to demonstration. Let's say this is you and this is your friend Horsey, okay, and this is all your buddies, and you and all your buddies, okay, beat up Horsey. That is a social sin because you did it together as a social unit, as a society. Okay, so that's a social sin. A personal sin is the sin of one person. A social sin is the sin of many people. So, and maybe you can think of an example yourself to put in there where it says example underneath. Next, the sin of commission versus a sin of omission. A sin that you commit versus a sin that you omit. If you omit something, it means you've left it out. You haven't done it. So a sin of commission is when you do something that you shouldn't do. Okay? So let's say, back to the example of you and Horsey. You knock him over. You shouldn't do that. That's a sin of commission. You have committed that sin. A sin of omission is when you don't do something that you should do, like not doing your homework. You know who I'm talking to. But let me give you another example. Not failing to do something you should do. So let's say you're here and your friend Horsey's here, okay, and then Big Horsey comes along, okay, and Big Horsey knocks out Little Horsey, okay, and you're standing there and you're like, oh my gosh, I should do something, but then you're like, nah, I think I'll go eat Cheetos instead. So instead of like calling a teacher or police or like saying, hey, stop that, you're just like, no, I'm going to go eat Cheetos. That is a sin of omission because you have omitted. You've left out something that you should have done. All right, moving right along. Venial sin or mortal sin. Now, so far, all the types of sin we've gone through, they've either been one or the other. They've either been original sin or actual sin. They've either been personal sin or social sin. They've either been sin of commission or omission. Venial sin and mortal sin, it's not so black and white. Yes, it's one or the other. It's kind of a spectrum, okay? Venial sin is what we use to talk about a less serious sin. Mortal sin is what we talk about a more serious sin, or sometimes it's called a deadly sin. When we say deadly sin, it means it's deadly for our souls, not that it actually has to kill someone to count as a mortal sin. So I kind of think of it as like a number line, as like a scale of 1 to 10. Okay, it's more or less venial or mortal. Now, how do you tell whether something's a venial sin or a mortal sin? There's 3 criteria for something to really be a mortal sin. And again, I try to, when I'm thinking about this, I try to think of it on a scale of 1 to 10. The first thing is it has to be a grave matter. Grave meaning serious. It has to have a certain amount of gravity to it. It has to be a certain heaviness. Okay? So like chewing gum in class, it's not good. Not really a grave matter. Okay? Telling your mom that you hate her and you think she's stupid, that's getting a little more serious. Okay, and then obviously things like, where you're actively hurting someone on purpose, things like that, those are more serious. So that's the first question you got to ask is how serious is it? The second thing that has to be met, the second criteria that has to be met for something to be a mortal sin is you have to have full knowledge of what you're doing. Okay, so you have to know that it's wrong. So if you, I remember when I was a little kid, one time I'd watched a movie and learned a bad word. And then I said that bad word when I was like, playing with my toys or something. And my mom was like, I can't believe you said that. And I was like, well, I didn't know it was bad. So I didn't get in trouble because I didn't know. Okay, now in a certain sense, you should know. Like if you get pulled over by a cop and he says, son, do you know how fast you're going? And you're like, nope, no idea. He's not going to let you off. There are certain things you're supposed to know. And if you don't know, that's your fault. But in general, if there's no way you could have reasonably been expected to know that something was wrong, then you're not as responsible for it, okay? And did you know how wrong it was is the other thing. Okay, and the last one is you have to have full consent. Consent means it's voluntary, meaning you chose to do it. Okay, so you didn't do it on accident, you weren't being pressured into it, you weren't being forced into it. Now again, these are all kind of gray areas. Yeah, I think you could put each one of these on kind of a scale of 1 to 10. Okay, so that's the end of the slideshow. And on the, where is it? Here it is. Okay, so what I want you to do next here is I want you to go through and categorize each of the following sins. Okay, now I'm going to give you a hint. Remember the definition of original and actual sin. Actual sins are the actual acts that you do. So anytime someone asks you if a sin is actual or original, it's always going to be actual, because the definition of actual sin is that it's an act. Original sin isn't talking about acts. It's talking about the disease of viciousness, of sinful tendencies that we have. Okay, so it's always going to be actual sin. Always, always, always. Okay, so these you're just going to circle one or the other. You're just like circle, okay, well, you circle actual, and then whatever you think, personal or social, and then commission or omission. You'll just circle those. And then over here, when you get to venial or mortal, you're going to walk through the 3 criteria and say, okay, I think this is on a scale of 1 to 10. I think it's like a 6. I think, I think he knew what he was doing. Did he know what he was doing? Maybe like an 8. Did he freely choose to do it? Yeah, I think he did, or I think he didn't. And then, make a conclusion on how mortal or venial it is. Okay, and again, morality is not a math problem. This isn't a real precise thing, but it's at least, it'll teach you the idea, get you thinking. So I want you to go through those 4 things. Last thing I want to talk about is I want to talk about why we have all this. What's the purpose in talking about why we have this type of sin versus that type of sin? Why do we have the 3 criteria? And it all goes back to that word that starts with a C that we talked about so much last unit, conscience. Conscience, conscience, conscience. The way we make decisions. But our conscience does something else than just help us make decisions. It helps us evaluate our past to plan for our future. So when you do something wrong and you want to learn from your mistakes, your conscience is what helps you to do that. And these categories can help you think about your sins and what you've done and say, well, did I really mean to do that? Like what can I really learn from here? Where did I go wrong? Okay? Was the problem that I didn't know what I was doing? Was the problem that I was with people that were a bad influence on me? Was the problem that, I did it on accident? This can help you identify all those sorts of things. And also the other thing is, Jesus came to set us free from sin. He came to set us free from that guilt. Yes, guilt is good because it helps us to reform our ways, but it's not good to stay trapped in our guilt. We should move on from our guilt. And so one of the ways that we can do that is by, especially when really bad stuff has kind of happened to us, by looking through our decisions and saying, well, this really wasn't my fault. That's not really something that I can take responsibility for. Sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes we feel guilty about things that we really shouldn't. Okay, because again, sin isn't just actions we do. Sin is also a disease that infects us. Anyway, we'll talk about this more, but good luck with the exercises. I'll see you guys soon. Bye-bye.